Europe in 1814 was a continent in transition, recovering from over a decade of continuous warfare precipitated by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars, which had begun in 1803 after the collapse of the short-lived Peace of Amiens, had embroiled nearly all European powers and reshaped the political and military map of the continent. By the spring of 1814, the exhaustion of French and Allied populations alike, coupled with the strain on national economies and military resources, had created a climate in which decisive military action and political settlements became both urgent and unavoidable. Napoleon himself, after a series of catastrophic campaigns in Russia in 1812 and the subsequent retreat through the harsh winter, saw the strength of his empire diminish. The catastrophic loss of approximately 400,000 men during the Russian campaign had irreversibly weakened his army, and the subsequent campaigns of the Sixth Coalition, comprising Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and other Allied states, further strained France's ability to maintain military dominance. By early 1814, coalition forces had penetrated France itself. The French defensive campaigns, led by Napoleon with what remained of his reorganized forces, were characterized by skillful tactical maneuvers, but were ultimately unable to match the numerical and logistical superiority of the Allies. On March 31, 1814, Napoleon suffered a decisive defeat when Paris fell to coalition forces. The capitulation of Paris made his position politically untenable. Facing insurmountable pressure, both from external military forces and internal political opposition, Napoleon formally abdicated on April 6, 1814. In the abdication, Napoleon renounced the throne for himself and his heirs, transferring power nominally to his son, Napoleon II, though the young child was unable to assume any practical control. The Allies, seeking to stabilize Europe, installed Louis XVIII, a member of the Bourbon dynasty, as King of France, signaling the restoration of the monarchy and the attempted re-establishment of pre-revolutionary order. Napoleon's abdication was followed by his exile to the island of Elba, located in the Mediterranean off the coast of Italy. The terms of his exile were unusually lenient for a defeated emperor. He was allowed sovereignty over Elba, retaining a personal guard of approximately 1,000 men, a modest navy, and a limited budget for administration. While this was intended as both a punishment and a containment measure, it was also a recognition by the European powers of his personal prominence and the potential risks of more severe treatment. From the perspective of the continental powers, Napoleon was effectively neutralized, and the expectation was that with France under Bourbon rule and a coalition-dominated Europe, lasting peace could be restored. In the meantime, the Congress of Vienna, convened in September 1814, became the central forum for negotiating the post-Napoleonic European order. Representatives from the major powers, including Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, met to redraw the map of Europe, address territorial disputes, and establish a balance of power that would prevent the resurgence of a single hegemonic state capable of dominating the continent. The Congress faced the enormous task of reconciling national ambitions, historical claims, and the aftermath of revolution and war. Its deliberations focused on territorial settlements, the restoration of dynastic legitimacy, the creation of buffer states, and the establishment of diplomatic protocols intended to prevent future large-scale conflicts. Although these negotiations were extensive and intricate, with overlapping interests and competing ambitions, They established the framework within which Europe hoped to maintain stability. Despite these efforts, tensions remained across the continent. France, though defeated militarily, retained a population and political culture shaped by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. Bonapartist sentiment persisted among veterans, administrators, and sections of the military who had benefited under Napoleon's rule. Economic strains, war debt, and social dislocation created dissatisfaction with Bourbon restoration policies. Louis XVIII, though cautious and seeking legitimacy, faced the dual challenge of reconciling the revolutionary changes in governance and law, particularly the Napoleonic Code, with the desire of the old aristocracy to reclaim pre-revolutionary privilege. The king's reliance on a moderate approach, including retention of certain Napoleonic institutions, was intended to mitigate unrest, but also left room for political instability, particularly among the military elite who had remained loyal to Napoleon or who were disillusioned with the Bourbons' perceived weakness. The international situation also contributed to the fragile peace. The coalition powers had differing priorities. Britain, under the leadership of the Prince Regent and its government, prioritized the containment of French power and the preservation of maritime dominance. Austria, led by Prince Metternich, sought the restoration of order and the prevention of revolutionary ideologies from spreading into Central Europe. Russia and Prussia, having borne the brunt of military campaigns against Napoleon, sought territorial gains and security guarantees. These differing objectives, while broadly aligned in terms of preventing another French hegemony, created a context in which Europe remained vigilant, aware that the stability achieved through military victory could be fragile. Within France, the military establishment remained largely intact despite the defeat. Napoleon's marshals and generals, including those who had survived the campaigns of 1813 to 1814, retained influence over portions of the army. The officer corps was experienced and often bound by personal loyalty to Napoleon rather than the Bourbons. France's conscripted and professional troops, numbering tens of thousands across various garrisons, had endured the hardship of prolonged campaigns, creating a shared military culture with strong esprit de corps. Although disarmed and reorganized under the Bourbon monarchy, this military infrastructure represented a latent source of power and potential unrest. Moreover, the French population, accustomed to revolutionary ideals of meritocracy and national pride, could be mobilized politically if a figure of authority, such as Napoleon, were to reassert influence. Napoleon's strategic acumen and political sensibility had not diminished. Even in exile, he maintained awareness of European affairs through correspondence, observation of coalition movements, and reports from sympathizers within France. His intelligence network, though limited compared with wartime operations, allowed him to gauge the effectiveness of Bourbon rule and the disposition of the military. Reports of unpopularity toward the Bourbons, combined with the recognition that coalition forces were not permanently stationed within France, likely informed his assessment of the potential for a return. The combination of lingering Bonapartist support, dissatisfaction with Bourbon policies, and the opportunity for decisive action created conditions that Napoleon could exploit, despite his formal status as an exiled ruler. The period between Napoleon's abdication and the resumption of hostilities in 1815, often referred to as the interregnum, was marked by preparation, observation, and diplomatic maneuvering across Europe. While the continent officially enjoyed peace, The underlying tensions of unresolved territorial disputes, competing national interests, and residual Napoleonic influence meant that this peace was provisional. France, though outwardly stabilized under the monarchy, retained internal fractures that could be activated by political or military leadership. The coalition powers, confident in their military advantage, were nonetheless aware of the logistical challenges of maintaining forces and influence in territories recently conquered or restored to pre-revolutionary rulers. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte began his escape from exile on the island of Elba, marking the initiation of a series of events that would become known as the 100 Days. Napoleon's exile had been intended to remove him permanently from European political and military affairs. Elba, situated in the Mediterranean off the coast of Tuscany, was a small island of approximately 224 square kilometers, providing limited resources and a nominal personal guard of around 1,000 men. Despite the restrictions, Napoleon maintained the semblance of sovereignty, governing the island with administrative and military structures reflective of his prior experience in France and Italy. The island's strategic location enabled him to observe European shipping lanes and communications, providing a limited but consistent flow of intelligence. Over the course of several months, Napoleon cultivated relationships with sympathetic figures in France, including former officers, loyal administrators, and emissaries capable of relaying information regarding the state of affairs under the Bourbon monarchy. Napoleon's departure from Elba was calculated and discreet. On the morning of February 26th, he boarded the brig Inconstant, accompanied by a small cohort of approximately 600 men, including a mix of officers, soldiers, and attendants. The fleet of the Allied powers, although dominant in the Mediterranean, had not maintained a continuous surveillance of Elba, creating a temporary opportunity for escape. The journey across the Ligurian Sea and along the western coast of Italy to the French mainland involved careful navigation to avoid detection by both British and French naval patrols. Napoleon's intelligence and planning ensured that his fleet remained largely unchallenged during this phase, demonstrating his continued strategic acumen despite years of previous setbacks. By March 1st, 1815, Napoleon landed at Golfe-Juan, on the southern coast of France near Cannes, marking the first step of his re-entry into French political life. The landing at Golfe-Juan was strategically significant. Southern France retained a mixed population, including Bonapartist sympathizers, moderate revolutionaries, and individuals disillusioned with the Bourbon monarchy. Napoleon was aware that the local garrisons and militia forces were not uniformly loyal to the Bourbons, and that his reputation among soldiers and the populace could be leveraged to generate momentum for his advance northward. Upon landing, Napoleon immediately began consolidating support by addressing the local population, issuing proclamations emphasizing his return to restore national pride and signaling his intent to reclaim authority. He emphasized continuity with the administrative reforms of the previous decade, including the Napoleonic Code, while contrasting his personal leadership with the perceived ineffectiveness and foreign influence of the Bourbon government. The march from Golfe-Juan to Grenoble, a distance of approximately 300 kilometers, involved both strategic planning and political calculation. Napoleon moved swiftly through towns and cities, making use of the road network and avoiding major Bourbon garrisons where possible. As he advanced, he attracted small detachments of troops from local garrisons and militia units, which were disaffected with the Bourbon regime. The personal loyalty of soldiers who had served under Napoleon, including veteran officers of the Grande Armée, contributed to a steady increase in force size. By March 7th, Napoleon had entered Grenoble with a substantial contingent, estimated at around 3,000 troops, where he began to issue further proclamations and arrange administrative structures to govern the areas under his influence. Grenoble represented a critical point in his march because it signaled the consolidation of a territorial base from which he could exert influence, organize logistics, and plan further movements toward Paris. A pivotal moment during this march was the encounter with Bourbon forces sent to intercept Napoleon. The Bourbon government, under King Louis XVIII, had become aware of Napoleon's landing and issued orders for military units to prevent his advance. Napoleon's approach to confrontation relied not on open battle initially, but on psychological and political strategy. As his forces approached the Royal Army units under Marshal Louis-Pierre Montbrun and General Marmont, Napoleon personally addressed troops, reminding them of their shared service under his previous campaigns and emphasizing loyalty to France rather than a particular regime. Historical records indicate that such encounters resulted in minimal resistance, with many units defecting to Napoleon's side without bloodshed. This phenomenon, later referred to as the March of the Army without firing a shot, underscored the continuing influence of Napoleon over the French military and the fragility of Bourbon authority within the army. By mid-March 1815, Napoleon's force had grown to approximately 10,000 men through voluntary enlistments, desertions from Bourbon garrisons, and reinforcements from sympathetic regions. His route north toward Lyon, Dijon, and ultimately Paris was characterized by rapid movement and a strategy of avoiding major engagements until his political position was secure. The speed of his advance created both psychological and logistical pressure on the Bourbon regime. Louis XVIII and his ministers faced the prospect of a rapidly consolidating Bonapartist force and insufficient loyal troops to mount an effective resistance. The king's administration, recognizing the limits of its military preparedness and the risk of civil unrest, began to consider options for evacuation or negotiation, reflecting the extent to which Napoleon's presence destabilized the political environment. Napoleon's approach to Lyon, one of France's most significant cities and a key logistical hub, exemplified his combination of political and military strategy. He utilized local committees, sympathetic civic officials, and his own emissaries to ensure that the city's gates would be opened without resistance. By doing so, he avoided potential urban conflict, maintained momentum, and preserved his forces for the continued advance toward the north. At this stage, his army had increased to roughly 15,000 men, a combination of infantry, cavalry, and limited artillery units, including veterans from previous campaigns and newly raised volunteers. The proportion of experienced soldiers remained significant, providing a core of disciplined troops capable of maintaining cohesion during the rapid march to Paris. As Napoleon approached the Paris region, the situation for the Bourbon monarchy deteriorated rapidly. Reports of Napoleon's advance, combined with intelligence on the defection of key military units, created panic within the royal court. King Louis XVIII, under pressure from advisors and concerned about the possibility of urban unrest or outright insurrection, evacuated Paris on March 19, 1815, moving toward the northeastern frontier of France in an attempt to coordinate loyal forces with coalition allies. The evacuation left Paris largely undefended, and Napoleon entered the city on March 20th, receiving minimal resistance. His return was characterized by systematic consolidation of authority, immediate reorganization of military units, and the restoration of administrative structures aligned with his prior governance model. During this period, Napoleon re-established control over central institutions of government, including the ministries responsible for finance, justice, and military organization. He retained many officials who had remained loyal during his previous reign, while also incorporating new personnel drawn from regions supportive of his return. Simultaneously, he addressed the national army, reinforcing command hierarchies, issuing orders to mobilize garrisons, and preparing for the eventual confrontation with coalition forces. By the end of March 1815, Napoleon's authority over France was effectively restored, with approximately 60,000 men under arms, though this number included varying levels of training and readiness. The international reaction to Napoleon's return was immediate and decisive. The major European powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, recognized the necessity of coordinated action. The rapidity of his reassertion of power undermined the earlier assumptions of permanent Bourbon authority and exposed vulnerabilities in the coalition's post-war planning. In response, the Seventh Coalition was formalized, bringing together the principal powers in a commitment to oppose Napoleon militarily. Strategic planning began to mobilize forces to prevent Napoleon from consolidating further and to intercept his army before it could threaten Allied territories. The coalition sought to act swiftly to prevent the reunification of French military strength with Napoleon's political authority from posing a renewed threat to continental stability. Napoleon's strategic position following his return was complex. While he commanded significant loyalty and experience within the French army, he faced challenges, including the need to rapidly reorganize logistics, maintain cohesion among newly enlisted troops, and anticipate the coalition's coordinated response. He also required the continued support of local populations and regional authorities to provide supplies, intelligence, and administrative cooperation. His calculations included both defensive and offensive measures, recognizing that the coalition would likely attempt to isolate and defeat his forces before they could achieve operational concentration sufficient to challenge Allied armies decisively. Throughout the 100 Days, Napoleon's return demonstrated the continued relevance of personal authority, military experience, and political acumen in shaping events. By combining rapid movement, persuasive engagement with troops and civic authorities, and strategic anticipation of coalition responses, he was able to restore control over France with minimal open conflict. The stage was thereby set for the next phase of events: the mobilization of coalition forces into Belgium, the deployment of French forces under Napoleon, and the eventual confrontation that would culminate in the Battle of Waterloo. Following Napoleon Bonaparte's return from Elba in March 1815, the major European powers quickly recognized the renewed threat posed by his restored authority. The period immediately after his re-establishment of control over France became critical for the formation, organization, and deployment of the coalition armies tasked with opposing him. The Seventh Coalition, which formally coalesced in April 1815, brought together Britain, Prussia, Austria, the Netherlands, Hanover, and smaller German states into a combined military effort designed to neutralize Napoleon before he could consolidate his forces and reassert French dominance on the continent. The strategic imperative for the coalition was clear: prevent Napoleon from isolating and defeating individual Allied armies before they could unite. Napoleon's previous campaigns had demonstrated his capacity for rapid, decisive operations, often striking one coalition member at a time while other forces remained distant or uncoordinated. To counter this, coalition planners emphasized the need for early concentration of forces, secure lines of communication, and coordinated maneuvers. The underlying principle guiding coalition strategy was that a combined approach, leveraging numerical superiority and geographical positioning, would maximize the chances of countering Napoleon's operational agility. The coalition's northern front, located in the Low Countries, became the primary focus of defensive planning. Belgium, then part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, occupied a strategic position along the border of France and the German states. The terrain, comprising a mixture of rolling plains, rivers, and fortified towns, provided both defensive advantages and logistical challenges. Coalition planners anticipated that Napoleon would seek to advance through this region, using the territory as a corridor to engage separate Allied forces before they could consolidate. The selection of defensive positions, deployment of fortifications, and the stationing of mobile reserves were key considerations in the preparation of the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies. The British contingent, commanded by Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, formed the core of the Anglo-Allied forces. Wellington, an experienced commander with extensive service in the Peninsular War against Napoleon's forces, had previously demonstrated a capacity for disciplined defensive operations, efficient use of terrain, and integrated coordination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. His command in 1815 encompassed not only British units, but also troops from the Netherlands, Hanover, Nassau, and Brunswick. The total strength of Wellington's army at the outset of deployment in Belgium was approximately 68,000 men, organized into infantry divisions, cavalry brigades, and artillery batteries, supplemented by reserve units capable of rapid reinforcement. The Army's composition reflected the integration of multinational contingents, each maintaining distinct command structures, equipment, and training, which required careful coordination and clear lines of authority under Wellington's overall leadership. The Prussian army, under the command of Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, constituted a second major pillar of coalition strength. Blücher, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars with extensive experience in large-scale engagements, commanded approximately 50,000 troops initially positioned in eastern Belgium and western Prussia. His forces were organized into corps formations capable of independent operations while remaining able to coordinate with Allied armies through prearranged plans and liaison officers. Prussian doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement, mobility, and resilience, reflecting lessons learned in previous campaigns against Napoleon, particularly during the 1813 to 1814 campaigns that had contributed to the emperor's initial defeat. Blücher's army included experienced infantry regiments, heavy and light cavalry, and substantial artillery units, enabling the Prussians to operate effectively in both offensive and defensive capacities. The coalition's command structure required detailed coordination to ensure operational cohesion. Communication between Wellington and Blücher relied on both direct dispatches and a network of liaison officers tasked with conveying orders, intelligence, and updates on troop movements. Given the limitations of early 19th century communications, delays and misinterpretations posed inherent risks. but the coalition mitigated these through predetermined contingency plans and shared strategic objectives. The principle of coordinated defense, whereby Prussian and Anglo-Allied forces would attempt to converge in response to Napoleon's offensive, formed the central tenet of coalition operational planning. Logistical preparations for the coalition armies were extensive. Supply chains were established to ensure the consistent delivery of food, ammunition, and equipment across the Belgian theater. Wellington's army relied on depots and regional stockpiles, supplemented by requisitioned supplies from local towns and territories under Allied control. Similarly, Blücher's Prussian forces maintained depots along key lines of communication, ensuring that corps could remain operational during maneuvers and engagements. The coordination of logistics extended to cavalry units, which required forage for horses, and artillery units, which necessitated the transport of heavy cannon and ammunition. The maintenance of these supply lines was critical to sustaining the readiness of coalition forces in anticipation of Napoleon's rapid offensive operations. Fortifications and defensive positions were established throughout the region. Key locations, including the towns of Brussels, surrounding villages, and river crossings, were fortified to impede French movement and provide strong points for defensive operations. Wellington's forces were instructed to utilize natural terrain features, including elevated ridges, hedgerows, and watercourses, to anchor defensive lines. These positions, combined with prepared redoubts and fortified farmhouses, were intended to absorb French assaults while allowing coalition forces to maintain cohesion and inflict maximum attrition on attacking units. Intelligence gathering was another critical component of coalition preparations. Cavalry patrols, scouts, and local informants provided information on French troop movements, logistics, and morale. Wellington, in particular, maintained a network capable of providing near real-time assessments of French advances, enabling him to adjust dispositions and reinforce threatened sectors. The Prussians, operating slightly farther east, monitored French movements from both military observation posts and intelligence reports transmitted via couriers. The ability to anticipate Napoleon's approach, identify likely points of attack, and implement prearranged defensive measures formed the backbone of coalition operational doctrine during this period. Diplomatic coordination underpinned military planning. The coalition powers were not homogeneous in objectives or priorities, and efforts were made to ensure agreement on strategic goals, allocation of resources, and commitment to mutual support. Britain prioritized limiting French influence and maintaining maritime supremacy, while Prussia and Austria were concerned with territorial security and the enforcement of agreements from the Congress of Vienna. These considerations influenced the disposition of forces, with Wellington maintaining a defensive posture near key urban centers and Blücher retaining mobility to support either defensive or offensive operations, depending on French actions. Training, drills, and preparation for engagement continued through May and June 1815. Allied forces conducted exercises in combined arms operations, integrating infantry squares, cavalry charges, and artillery coordination. Troops were briefed on anticipated French tactics, including artillery bombardments, massed infantry assaults, and cavalry maneuvers. Commanders at division and brigade levels were issued specific orders regarding flexibility, response to flanking movements, and fallback procedures in the event of localized setbacks. This preparation was essential, given the multinational composition of Wellington's army, the variety of experience levels among units, and the anticipated intensity of the forthcoming confrontation with Napoleon's forces. The coalition also considered the broader strategic geography of Belgium. The region's network of rivers, including the Dyle, Seine, and Sambre, created natural obstacles that could be exploited for defensive purposes. Roads connecting towns such as Brussels, Nivelles, and Charleroi were identified as critical lines for troop movement and supply. Fortified villages, including Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate, were integrated into defensive plans as points to anchor resistance and delay French advances, allowing coalition forces to maintain coherence and enable counteroffensives. The prepositioning of reserves behind these positions allowed for the flexible response to localized French attacks while preserving the overall integrity of the defensive line. Coordination extended to the management of communication between Allied units, particularly given differences in language, command structure, and operational doctrine. Liaison officers were embedded within corps, and signals, couriers, and prearranged messages facilitated the transfer of information across the theater. These measures reduced the risk of miscommunication, ensured alignment of objectives, and enabled timely reinforcements. The integration of these organizational mechanisms reflected lessons learned from previous campaigns, where poor coordination had contributed to French operational success. As the coalition forces finalized preparations, attention turned to the anticipated French offensive. Reports indicated that Napoleon intended to strike decisively before the coalition could fully concentrate its forces. Both Wellington and Blücher recognized the necessity of holding positions long enough to ensure mutual support while exploiting the terrain and fortifications to reduce the effectiveness of French assaults. The emphasis on discipline, controlled engagement, and cohesion under fire represented a deliberate strategy to counter Napoleon's historical advantage in speed, tactical flexibility, and the use of combined arms. By early June 1815, the coalition had established a comprehensive defensive network across southern and central Belgium. Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, numbering approximately 68,000 men, occupied positions along key ridges and fortified villages, prepared to withstand artillery bombardments and infantry assaults. Blücher's Prussian force, approximately 50,000 strong, maintained mobility to support threatened sectors, respond to French maneuvers, and ensure the convergence of Allied forces if required. These deployments represented a balance of static defense and operational flexibility, reflecting careful planning designed to neutralize Napoleon's capacity for decisive engagement before coalition forces could unite. The final weeks before engagement were characterized by continued vigilance, logistical reinforcement, and intelligence monitoring. Cavalry patrols observed French movements from northern France, while scouts provided information on French concentrations near the Sambre and Charleroi. Artillery units were positioned to dominate approaches, fortifications were reinforced, and reserves were maintained to respond to unexpected developments. Coalition commanders emphasized the importance of maintaining discipline, coordination, and readiness, understanding that the coming confrontation with Napoleon would be decisive in determining the outcome of the restored European order. By mid-June 1815, the coalition forces were fully prepared to respond to Napoleon's advances. The strategic, logistical, and organizational measures implemented over the preceding months created a robust defensive posture designed to withstand initial French offensives, enable coordinated counterattacks, and ultimately prevent Napoleon from achieving the rapid, decisive victories that had characterized his previous campaigns. These preparations, reflecting meticulous planning and integration of multinational forces, set the stage for the engagements that would culminate in the Battle of Waterloo, a confrontation that would determine the fate of France and the stability of Europe for the decade to follow. In the months following his return from Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte faced the complex task of reconstituting the French military and preparing for operations against the Seventh Coalition. The political and military situation in France required careful management of resources, loyalty, and strategy. By mid-1815, Napoleon had assembled an army of approximately 73,000 men, a combination of experienced veterans, newly recruited conscripts, and National Guardsmen mobilized to secure the nation against the threat posed by coalition forces advancing through Belgium. The composition of this army reflected both the strengths and weaknesses inherent in the French military at the time. While experienced units retained institutional cohesion and tactical proficiency, newly raised formations required training and integration into operational structures. The French army was organized according to the Napoleonic system, which emphasized a combination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery in mutually supporting formations. Infantry comprised the largest component, including line regiments trained for coordinated volleys, column advances, and square formations to resist cavalry charges. These units were supplemented by elite formations, such as the Old Guard and select grenadiers and voltigas, whose discipline, experience, and morale were considered decisive in critical moments of battle. Infantry units were arranged into divisions, brigades, and corps under the command of Napoleon's marshals, facilitating operational flexibility and enabling decentralized command within an overall strategic framework. Cavalry units played a critical role in Napoleon's operational planning. Heavy cavalry, including cuirassiers and carabiniers, provided shock capability capable of breaking enemy lines, exploiting gaps, and pursuing retreating forces. Like cavalry, comprising chasseurs and hussars, was used for reconnaissance, screening movements, and harassment of enemy formations. Artillery, both foot and horse batteries, was integrated into the core structure to deliver concentrated fire, disrupt enemy formations, and provide support for infantry and cavalry maneuvers. French artillery at this time remained technologically advanced, with highly mobile 6- and 12-pounder cannons and howitzers capable of rapid deployment and precise targeting. The command structure of the French army reflected Napoleon's reliance on experienced marshals who had served in previous campaigns. Key figures included Marshal Michel, known as the bravest of the brave, entrusted with leading cavalry operations and executing aggressive assaults; Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, responsible for the coordination of separate corps and subsequent pursuit operations; and Marshal Nicolas Soult, overseeing the organization and deployment of reserve forces and supporting operations. Additional commanders, such as Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout and Marshal Jean-Baptiste MacDonald, contributed expertise in infantry deployment and defensive positioning, ensuring that the French army retained operational cohesion despite the mixed experience levels among units. Napoleon's strategic considerations in assembling this army were shaped by both political and military imperatives. The primary objective was to strike decisively against coalition forces before they could fully concentrate, exploiting speed, initiative, and the element of surprise. Historical precedent, including the campaigns of 1805, 1809, and 1812 demonstrated the efficacy of rapid maneuver and concentrated assaults against separated enemy formations. Napoleon's calculations emphasized the risk of delay, recognizing that coalition coordination, once established, would negate the advantages offered by the French army's operational flexibility. The strategic plan involved a rapid advance into Belgium, where Napoleon anticipated engaging the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher before they could unite. Intelligence reports and reconnaissance indicated that Wellington's forces were distributed along the ridges and fortifications near Brussels, while the Prussians maintained positions east of the French advance. Napoleon's objective was to achieve operational superiority by isolating one army, defeating it decisively, and then redirecting forces to confront the second, thereby preventing combined action by the coalition. This strategy, rooted in the principles of interior lines and concentrated force, reflected both the operational experience of Napoleon and the doctrinal assumptions of the French military. The advance into Belgium required meticulous logistical planning. Supplies of food, ammunition, and equipment had to accompany the army along lines vulnerable to disruption by enemy action or terrain constraints. Napoleon implemented a system of supply depots, requisition from local towns, and movement of convoys coordinated with marching formations to maintain operational readiness. Cavalry and artillery units were allocated mobility priorities to ensure they could support infantry operations effectively, particularly in terrain featuring ridges, rivers, and villages that could constrain movement. The logistical planning accounted for the need to maintain operational tempo, as delays could allow coalition forces to concentrate and negate the advantage of initiative. The French army's deployment for the campaign reflected both strategic and tactical considerations. Napoleon positioned his corps along routes designed to facilitate rapid concentration at points of decisive engagement. The right wing, under Marshal Ney, was tasked with advancing toward key locations that could threaten Wellington's positions and compel defensive allocation of Allied forces. The left wing, under Marshal Grouchy, maintained flexibility to respond to Prussian movements, conduct reconnaissance, and intercept reinforcements. Central reserves, including portions of the Imperial Guard and artillery, were held to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce threatened sectors. This deployment mirrored Napoleon's previous operational patterns, emphasizing mobility, flexibility, and the ability to concentrate firepower and manpower at critical points. Political considerations influenced both recruitment and command decisions. Napoleon relied on the loyalty of veteran officers who retained allegiance from prior campaigns, integrating them into key command positions to ensure discipline and cohesion. Recruitment efforts emphasized regional mobilization, appealing to conscripts' sense of national duty and loyalty to the restored emperor. Units were assembled with consideration for experience levels, combining veteran battalions with newly raised regiments to maintain operational balance. Training exercises conducted during the advance to Belgium reinforced discipline, coordinated movement, and familiarity with battlefield procedures, mitigating some of the risks posed by inexperienced troops. Intelligence gathering and reconnaissance were central to Napoleon's operational planning. Cavalry units, scouts, and local informants provided detailed reports on enemy positions, fortifications, and movements. These assessments informed decisions regarding concentration points, routes of advance, and allocation of reserves. Napoleon's ability to interpret intelligence rapidly and implement corresponding maneuvers was a defining characteristic of his command style, allowing him to exploit opportunities and adapt to evolving battlefield conditions. Napoleon's strategy also accounted for the coalition's operational doctrine. He anticipated that Wellington would adopt a defensive posture utilizing terrain and fortified villages to resist French assaults, while Blücher's Prussian forces would maneuver aggressively to support Allied positions. Napoleon's response involved calculated feints, diversionary movements, and concentrated attacks designed to draw the Anglo-Allied army into engagement while isolating Prussian contingents. The objective was to deliver decisive blows sequentially, preventing coalition armies from linking forces and maintaining the initiative throughout the campaign. In the days preceding the main engagement, French forces advanced along parallel routes through the Sambre and Meuse River valleys, securing crossings, suppressing minor opposition, and preparing for coordinated assaults on coalition positions. The movement of infantry columns, supported by artillery batteries and screened by cavalry, reflected a deliberate emphasis on both speed and protection of critical units. Communication between corps and division commanders was maintained through messengers, signal flags, and prearranged orders, allowing Napoleon to orchestrate complex maneuvers across a dispersed force. Napoleon's strategic planning emphasized flexibility in response to unexpected developments. Contingency plans included measures for reinforcing sectors facing unanticipated resistance, repositioning cavalry for pursuit or counterattack, and employing reserves to exploit breakthroughs. The use of high-quality artillery, combined with disciplined infantry formations and the shock potential of cavalry, provided a tactical toolkit capable of responding to various battlefield scenarios. This operational design sought to maximize the Army's combat effectiveness despite the heterogeneous composition of veteran and newly recruited units. Political, logistical, and operational considerations converged in Napoleon's deployment decisions. Each corps and division was assigned specific objectives, routes of march, and engagement priorities, while Central Command retained the ability to modify dispositions in response to coalition movements. Coordination of artillery, infantry, and cavalry ensured mutual support and maintained the integrity of offensive and defensive operations. These preparations reflected Napoleon's historical emphasis on combined arms integration, rapid maneuver, and the decisive application of force at critical points. By early June 1815, Napoleon's army had moved into positions near the French-Belgian border, poised to execute the initial stages of the campaign. The strategic objective remained to engage the Anglo-Allied and Prussian forces separately, achieving operational superiority through rapid concentration and decisive combat. The French army, despite variances in experience and training, retained a core of veterans, disciplined units, and competent commanders, forming a force capable of executing complex maneuvers and sustaining high-intensity operations. Napoleon's planning reflected both historical precedent and an acute understanding of the operational environment, encompassing terrain, coalition dispositions, logistics, and the psychology of command. The final weeks preceding the Battle of Waterloo involved continued reconnaissance, consolidation of supplies, and coordination of corps movements. Napoleon's strategic vision relied on exploiting timing, mobility, and the relative inexperience of certain coalition contingents to achieve localized superiority. Commanders received precise instructions regarding the sequence of attacks, positioning of artillery, and use of cavalry to disrupt enemy formations. Emphasis was placed on maintaining morale, cohesion, and discipline across the army, recognizing that the ability to execute complex maneuvers under fire would be decisive in the coming engagements. By the eve of the campaign, Napoleon's forces were concentrated in the regions surrounding Charleroi and the Sambre, poised for the initial engagement against Prussian forces at Ligny and the Anglo-Allied army at Quatre-Bras. The army's composition, command structure, and operational plan reflected careful integration of experience, logistics, and intelligence, designed to maximize the potential for decisive success. The combination of veteran leadership, disciplined troops, and flexible strategy positioned the French army to exploit the coalition's vulnerabilities, while Napoleon's strategic calculations sought to deliver the rapid, concentrated blows that had historically defined his military success. The campaign of June 1815 began in earnest with Napoleon Bonaparte's advance into the southern region of Belgium, following weeks of careful preparation and concentration of the French army along the French-Belgian border. The strategic objective was clear: strike the coalition forces before the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher could unite, preventing coordinated resistance and allowing Napoleon to achieve localized superiority. The geography of southern Belgium, encompassing the Sambre and Meuse River valleys, rolling plains, and fortified towns, played a critical role in shaping the initial engagements, influencing both maneuver and defensive positioning. On the 15th and the 16th of June 1815, Napoleon executed a series of preliminary operations designed to separate the coalition armies, disrupt communications, and establish advantageous positions for the decisive engagement to follow. The first major engagement occurred at the village of Ligny on June 16th, where the French army confronted the Prussian forces under Blücher. The French deployed their army in three corps formations, with the right wing commanded by Marshal Ney, the center under Napoleon's direct command, and the left wing held by Marshal Grouchy. The deployment leveraged the French principle of coordinated corps maneuver, allowing for simultaneous pressure across multiple sectors while maintaining flexibility for reinforcement and exploitation of breakthroughs. At Ligny, the Prussian army, numbering approximately 84,000 men organized into four corps, occupied defensive positions along ridges and wooded areas near the villages of Ligny, Saint-Amand, and Gembloux. Blücher's strategic intent was to hold these positions long enough to prevent a rapid French advance, buying time for coordination with Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces. Prussian forces were arranged in depth, with infantry supported by artillery batteries and cavalry positioned on flanks to protect against envelopment. While prepared for engagement, the Prussians faced challenges related to terrain, including marshy areas and narrow approaches, which constrained deployment flexibility and limited maneuver options for their larger formations. The battle commenced in the morning of June 16th with a coordinated French artillery bombardment, targeting Prussian defensive positions. Napoleon sought to weaken the cohesion of enemy formations, disrupt command and control, and prepare the ground for infantry and cavalry assaults. French infantry advanced in column formations, supported by artillery fire, moving against the Prussian lines in a series of attacks designed to probe for weaknesses and create localized superiority. Cavalry units, including heavy cuirassiers and light chasseurs, were employed to threaten flanks, pursue isolated units, and exploit any breaches in Prussian defenses. The engagement at Ligny evolved into intense combat across multiple villages and ridges. French forces succeeded in capturing Saint-Amand and pressing against Prussian positions at Ligny itself. Marshal Ney's corps conducted flanking maneuvers to prevent Prussian withdrawal and maintain pressure across the front. Despite tactical setbacks and heavy casualties, Prussian units retained cohesion, withdrawing in an organized fashion rather than disintegrating under French assaults. By the end of the day, the French achieved a tactical victory, capturing key positions. Concurrently, on June 16th, the French attempted to engage Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces at Quatre-Bras, a crossroads located roughly 20 kilometers north of Ligny. Marshal Ney was tasked with this operation, intended to prevent Wellington from advancing to support the Prussians. Wellington's army, approximately 68,000 strong, included British, Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and Brunswick contingents. Troops were positioned to defend the critical junction of Quatre-Bras, ensuring control over the road network linking Charleroi, Nivelles, and Brussels. The terrain included ridges, hedgerows, and farm buildings, which Wellington utilized to anchor defensive positions, compensating for the numerical inferiority in specific sectors and allowing effective use of artillery and infantry firepower. The engagement at Quatre-Bras was marked by a series of defensive actions, with Wellington ordering brigades to hold key positions, repulse French attacks, and prevent envelopment. French forces launched multiple assaults on the crossroads, seeking to seize control and isolate segments of the Anglo-Allied army. Infantry columns advanced under artillery support, while cavalry attempted to outflank the defensive lines. Wellington's use of terrain and fortified positions enabled effective resistance, allowing his forces to absorb attacks without significant positional loss. Casualties were incurred on both sides, with estimates of approximately 4,000 for the Anglo-Allied forces and 5,000 to 6,000 for the French. Despite intense fighting, Wellington maintained control of Quatre-Bras, ensuring that the Anglo-Allied army remained positioned to support the Prussians if necessary. The simultaneous engagements at Ligny and Quatre-Bras underscored the strategic logic of Napoleon's plan to defeat coalition forces in detail. By engaging the Prussians at Ligny and the Anglo-Allied forces at Quatre-Bras, the French sought to prevent coordination and isolate each opponent. However, several factors limited the effectiveness of these preliminary operations. The resilience of Prussian forces, coupled with their organized withdrawal rather than rout, preserved their ability to regroup and maintain operational coordination. Wellington's disciplined defense at Quatre-Bras ensured that his army remained intact and capable of responding to subsequent French advances. The limitations in French cavalry mobility, terrain challenges, and coordination difficulties among corps also constrained the full realization of Napoleon's objectives. Following the engagements of June 16th, French forces advanced toward positions that would set the stage for the decisive confrontation at Waterloo. Ligny provided Napoleon with control over local terrain and demonstrated the offensive capability of his army, yet it failed to neutralize the Prussian threat entirely. Similarly, Quatre-Bras prevented French forces from isolating Wellington, ensuring that Anglo-Allied units remained available for the upcoming engagement. The operational outcomes highlighted both the effectiveness of French tactical doctrine and the resilience of coalition forces, establishing conditions for a larger, coordinated battle where terrain, force disposition, and timing would be decisive. In the aftermath of Ligny and Quatre-Bras, Both coalition and French commanders undertook rapid reorganization and redeployment. Napoleon, recognizing the partial success at Ligny but the failure to neutralize Wellington, adjusted his deployment for the advance toward Waterloo. Corps positions were realigned to consolidate offensive potential, reserve units were allocated to reinforce threatened sectors, and reconnaissance continued to identify advantageous terrain for the main engagement. Marshal Ney, meanwhile, was instructed to maintain pressure on Wellington while coordinating with Napoleon's Central Command to ensure synchronized movements. The French army, despite achieving initial objectives, faced the operational challenge of coordinating multiple corps across dispersed terrain while anticipating coalition maneuvers. On the coalition side, Blücher's Prussian forces conducted an organized withdrawal northward toward Wavre, maintaining cohesion and the ability to support Allied operations. Infantry and cavalry units were positioned to cover retreating forces, fortified villages were prepared for delaying actions, and supply lines were maintained to ensure continued operational readiness. Wellington's forces, maintaining positions near Quatre-Bras, were reinforced with brigades drawn from surrounding garrisons, allowing the Anglo-Allied army to stabilize the defensive front and prepare for coordination with arriving Prussian units. Strategic communication and liaison between Wellington and Blücher became critical at this stage, as both commanders anticipated the possibility of renewed French assaults. The terrain in the region played a decisive role in shaping subsequent deployments. Rolling hills, ridges, and river valleys provided natural defensive advantages for coalition forces, while open fields and roads allowed French corps to maneuver for offensive operations. Fortified farmhouses and small villages, including Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate, were identified as key positions to anchor defensive lines, control avenues of approach, and provide firing positions for artillery and infantry. Both sides conducted reconnaissance and preliminary positioning to exploit these features, ensuring that the forthcoming battle would be influenced heavily by terrain as well as troop strength and disposition. Supply considerations remained a central concern for both French and coalition forces. The rapid movement of troops, combined with the demands of consecutive engagements at Ligny and Quatre-Bras, required careful management of provisions, ammunition, and forage for cavalry units. French corps were supported by supply convoys and requisitioned local resources, while coalition forces utilized depots and regional stockpiles to sustain operational capacity. Maintaining logistics under the constraints of terrain, ongoing skirmishes, and dispersed formations was critical for ensuring readiness for the decisive engagement anticipated on June 18th. By June 17th, all forces had completed initial redeployments, with the French army concentrating near Waterloo, while coalition forces established defensive lines across strategic ridges and prepared for the arrival of Prussian reinforcements. Commanders on both sides conducted final assessments of terrain, troop readiness, and logistical status. Orders were issued for the positioning of artillery, placement of infantry and cavalry, and coordination among corps and brigades. The preliminary engagements had set the stage for a confrontation in which operational planning discipline and terrain utilization would determine the outcome, with both Napoleon and coalition commanders fully aware that the next engagement would be decisive in the campaign. The engagements at Ligny and Quatre-Bras, therefore, represent the critical opening moves in the Waterloo campaign. They illustrate the operational complexity of Napoleonic warfare, including simultaneous multi-corps operations, coordination of combined arms, and the influence of terrain and timing on strategic outcomes. While Napoleon achieved a tactical victory at Ligny, the failure to destroy the Prussian army and the resistance at Quatre-Bras preserved the coalition's capacity for coordinated defense and counterattack. These outcomes shaped the deployment of forces for the impending main battle, influencing the positions of French corps, the establishment of defensive lines by Wellington, and the operational decisions that would culminate in the Battle of Waterloo. On the morning of June 18, 1815, the stage for the decisive engagement of the Waterloo campaign was set. Napoleon Bonaparte had concentrated the French army, numbering approximately 73,000 men, along the ridge near the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, a position south of the town of Waterloo. The strategic intent was to bring the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington, estimated at 68,000 men, into battle, defeat them before Prussian reinforcements could arrive, and thereby achieve operational supremacy in the southern Belgian theater. The French army was arrayed with the center under Napoleon's personal command, the right wing commanded by Marshal Ney, and the left wing under Marshal Grouchy, who had been detached to pursue Prussian forces moving toward Wavre. The deployment reflected Napoleon's principle of concentration at decisive points while maintaining flexibility to respond to enemy movements. Wellington's army occupied a series of defensive positions along the Mont-Saint-Jean ridge, extending from the farm of Hougoumont on the right flank to La Haye-Saint near the center and Pays-Platé on the left. The terrain consisted of gently rolling ridges, intersected by roads, hedgerows, and small villages, providing strong defensive features. Wellington positioned his infantry in linear formations behind hedges and ditches, supported by strategically placed artillery batteries capable of enfilading advancing French columns. Cavalry units were deployed in reserve behind the ridge to exploit breakthroughs or counter French flanking maneuvers. Wellington's dispositions reflected his experience in defensive warfare, emphasizing terrain utilization, coordination of arms, and the maintenance of operational reserves to absorb and respond to French attacks. The battle began in the late morning with an artillery bombardment initiated by French batteries positioned on the crest of the ridge. Napoleon intended to soften Allied defenses, disrupt command and control, and prepare the ground for subsequent infantry assaults. French artillery, including 6 and 12-pounder cannons and howitzers, delivered sustained fire against Anglo-Allied positions, targeting concentrations of infantry and fortified buildings. Wellington's artillery, positioned behind the ridge, returned fire with disciplined volleys, inflicting casualties on French formations while minimizing exposure of gun crews. The initial exchanges of artillery demonstrated the importance of terrain, range, and positioning, with both sides seeking to achieve localized superiority before committing infantry to direct engagement. Following the preliminary bombardment, French infantry advanced in column formations toward key defensive positions. Marshal Ney's right wing conducted the initial assault on Hougoumont, a fortified farmhouse complex anchored by walls, gardens, and adjacent orchards. Hougoumont was held by British Guards and Nassau troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell. The French attack involved repeated infantry advances supported by artillery, intended to seize the farm and threaten Wellington's right flank. Combat at Hougoumont involved sustained musketry, limited artillery exchanges, and close-quarters fighting as French forces attempted to breach the walls and defensive positions. Despite repeated assaults, defenders maintained cohesion, utilizing terrain, fortifications, and disciplined fire to repel attackers and prevent the capture of the position during the morning phase. Simultaneously, French columns targeted the center of Wellington's line at La Haye-Sainte, a farmhouse positioned on the main road between Hougoumont and Pays-Plate. The defense of La Haye-Sainte was assigned to elements of the King's German Legion, experienced troops trained in linear fire formations and capable of rapid reorganization under fire. French infantry advanced under artillery support, seeking to seize the farmhouse and create a breach in the Anglo-Allied center. Early assaults were repulsed by disciplined defensive fire, with infantry maintaining formations to deliver volleys while absorbing casualties. The intensity of fighting at La Haye-Sainte reflected both the importance of the position for controlling the road network and the integration of fortifications into defensive strategy. French attacks on the left flank and positions near Pays-Plate were coordinated to fix Allied forces in place and prevent redeployment. Infantry columns, supported by horse artillery and light cavalry, engaged in skirmishing with coalition troops, seeking to probe for weaknesses and create opportunities for concentrated assault. The defenders, composed of British and Allied infantry, utilized prepared positions, hedgerows, and shallow ditches to anchor their line. Cavalry units in reserve conducted reconnaissance and provided support to threatened sectors, reinforcing infantry and countering limited French flanking movements. These engagements, though less intense than the main assaults at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, were essential in maintaining the cohesion of Wellington's defensive line and preventing French penetration. Marshal Ney, observing that initial assaults had failed to achieve rapid success, committed cavalry forces to probe the Anglo-Allied positions. Heavy cavalry, including cuirassiers and carabineers, advanced in massed formations, seeking to break infantry squares and exploit any breach in the defensive line. Wellington's infantry, trained in square formations to resist cavalry, held discipline under repeated charges, delivering coordinated musket volleys that inflicted heavy casualties while maintaining formation integrity. Light cavalry conducted countercharges to disrupt French reconnaissance and harass units attempting to reform after failed assaults. These early cavalry engagements demonstrated the limitations of frontal cavalry charges against well-prepared infantry and highlighted the importance of coordination between arms in defensive operations. Napoleon, assessing the progress of the morning phase, directed additional infantry and artillery to reinforce attacks on key positions. Columns were repositioned to exploit perceived weaknesses, with artillery batteries delivering concentrated fire to suppress enemy musketry and create gaps for infantry penetration. Communication between corps commanders relied on mounted messengers and signal flags, allowing adjustments to deployments in response to battlefield developments. The French command aimed to achieve local superiority at decisive points, reflecting operational doctrine emphasizing combined arms, concentrated effort, and exploitation of terrain features to disrupt enemy defenses. The morning engagements also demonstrated the resilience of coalition forces under sustained pressure. Wellington's use of terrain, prepared defensive positions, and disciplined coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery enabled his army to absorb initial French assaults without strategic compromise. Commanders at division and brigade levels exercised initiative within the framework of Wellington's overall plan, repositioning units to reinforce threatened sectors, rotate fatigued troops, and maintained continuous defensive pressure against French attacks. The integration of multinational contingents required clear command structures and adherence to prearranged defensive principles, ensuring cohesion despite differences in language, training, and equipment. French casualties during the morning engagements were significant, resulting from sustained musketry, artillery fire, and limited countercharges by coalition cavalry. Infantry losses were incurred during repeated assaults on fortified positions, while cavalry suffered under disciplined infantry squares and supporting artillery. Coalition forces experienced casualties primarily from artillery bombardment and skirmishing, with infantry holding defensive positions sustaining losses while maintaining operational effectiveness. The casualty distribution reflected the intensity of combat at fortified locations, the effectiveness of prepared defensive positions, and the operational risk associated with frontal assaults on well-defended terrain. As the morning phase progressed, the French command sought to maintain pressure while preparing for more concentrated attacks later in the day. The objective remained to breach key defensive positions, disrupt the cohesion of Wellington's army, and create conditions for a decisive engagement before Prussian forces could intervene. Infantry units rotated forward, artillery batteries repositioned to cover newly identified avenues of approach, and cavalry maintained readiness to exploit breakthroughs. Communication between Napoleon and subordinate commanders facilitated coordination, ensuring that corps and divisions operated in concert despite the dispersed nature of the battlefield and the challenging terrain. By mid-morning, it became evident that Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate would remain focal points of French effort throughout the day. The defensive success of these positions, combined with the disciplined use of infantry squares and artillery support, prevented French forces from achieving rapid breakthroughs. Napoleon's strategy relied on sequential concentration of forces to overcome these points, but the initial morning engagements indicated that coalition defenses were resilient, tactical coordination effective, and the combination of terrain and prepared positions provided a substantial defensive advantage. These early encounters established the framework for subsequent phases of the battle, influencing decisions regarding troop deployment, reserve utilization, and timing of major assaults. The integration of artillery into French attacks remained a central feature of the morning engagements. French batteries were deployed on elevated positions to deliver sustained bombardment against Anglo-Allied lines, targeting concentrations of infantry, key defensive buildings, and points of tactical significance. Coalition artillery responded with disciplined fire, often delivering enfilading shots against advancing columns and contributing to the attrition of attacking forces. The interaction of artillery, infantry, and cavalry in this phase exemplified the combined arms doctrine central to Napoleonic warfare, demonstrating both the offensive potential and the limitations imposed by terrain, defensive preparation, and troop discipline. Simultaneously, command decisions on the Anglo-Allied side reflected Wellington's focus on maintaining defensive integrity and operational flexibility. Brigades were repositioned as threats emerged, reserves deployed to reinforce pressured sectors, and cavalry used selectively to disrupt French formations. Communication between Wellington and subordinates, facilitated by mounted messengers and prearranged signals, ensured a timely response to French attacks and preserved cohesion across the defensive line. These measures allowed the Anglo-Allied army to withstand sustained French pressure during the morning without strategic compromise or loss of critical positions. By midday on June 18th, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo had entered a critical phase, characterized by intensified French assaults, coordinated Anglo-Allied defensive responses, and the gradual shaping of conditions that would determine the outcome of the engagement. Napoleon Bonaparte, observing the initial morning engagements, directed concentrated attacks on key positions while attempting to exploit weaknesses in Wellington's line. The French army, numbering approximately 73,000 men, had suffered casualties during early assaults on fortified positions such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, but maintained operational cohesion, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery integrated under a coordinated command structure. Napoleon's strategy for the midday phase focused on breaking the center and flanks of the Anglo-Allied army to force a decisive collapse before Prussian reinforcements could arrive. Marshal Ney, commanding the French right wing, remained engaged with the farm complex of Hougoumont. Despite repeated morning assaults, the position had not fallen, and the defenders, including the British Guards and Nassau troops, maintained discipline, utilizing hedges, walls, and the internal layout of the complex to resist French penetration. French infantry repeatedly attempted to enter the enclosure, while artillery bombardment continued to soften defenses. Ney committed additional columns to support the assault, coordinating infantry with heavy cavalry in limited frontal and flanking attacks. These operations, while aggressive, were constrained by the nature of the terrain and the strong defensive positions held by coalition forces, which absorbed repeated assaults without significant compromise of the defensive line. Simultaneously, French efforts concentrated on La Haye-Sainte, a farmhouse situated on the main road connecting Hougoumont and the center of Wellington's line. The King's German Legion, stationed within La Haye-Sainte, had withstood morning assaults, maintaining firing positions and utilizing the defensive features of the building and surrounding walls. By midday, French infantry intensified attacks, committing additional battalions to seize the farmhouse and create a breach in the Anglo-Allied center. Artillery fire targeted both defenders and the building itself, while French skirmishers and light cavalry threatened to cut off reinforcement routes. After prolonged combat, French forces succeeded in capturing La Haye-Sainte, although at substantial cost, with infantry casualties in repeated assaults numbering several thousand and artillery losses similarly significant. The capture of the farmhouse represented a tactical gain for the French, but did not result in a collapse of the Anglo-Allied center. On the left flank, French columns engaged coalition positions near Pays Plate and the surrounding farms. These attacks were designed to fix Wellington's forces in place, prevent repositioning to counter French assaults elsewhere, and create pressure that could be exploited in conjunction with central breakthroughs. French infantry advanced under artillery support, encountering resistance from British, Dutch, Belgian, and Hanoverian units entrenched behind hedgerows and ditches. Cavalry units screened movements and conducted limited flanking maneuvers, but were constrained by terrain and prepared defenses. The sustained pressure along the left ensured that coalition forces could not redeploy freely, yet did not achieve a decisive breakthrough. Marshal Ney also directed cavalry operations during the midday phase, employing heavy cavalry, cuirassiers, carabineers, and dragoons in mass charges against Wellington's infantry squares. Infantry squares, formed with disciplined ranks, bayonets outward, and overlapping fire, proved highly resistant to cavalry charges. French cavalry repeatedly suffered losses from coordinated musketry and artillery, while the squares maintained cohesion despite repeated assaults. Light cavalry units were used to screen, reconnoiter, and disrupt artillery and skirmishers, but massed frontal charges against prepared infantry remained ineffective. These engagements underscored the limitations of cavalry when faced with disciplined formations and coordinated combined arms defense, highlighting the operational challenge of overcoming well-positioned defenders without artillery and infantry support. Napoleon, recognizing that initial assaults had not achieved rapid success, directed reserves into critical sectors. The Imperial Guard, elite and experienced troops, was held under his personal command as a strategic reserve, intended to exploit opportunities or reinforce sectors under severe pressure. Artillery was repositioned to deliver concentrated fire on key defensive positions, including La Haye-Sainte and supporting hedgerow positions, in preparation for coordinated infantry assaults. French infantry corps were instructed to maintain pressure across the front, seeking incremental gains, and to prepare for exploitation of any weaknesses identified in coalition lines. Communication and coordination between corps were maintained through mounted messengers, enabling real-time adjustment of troop dispositions. Wellington, observing French assaults on multiple fronts, undertook tactical adjustments to stabilize the defensive line. Brigades were repositioned to reinforce sectors under greatest pressure, reserves committed selectively to threatened points, and artillery redeployed to maximize coverage of likely avenues of attack. Cavalry units remained in reserve behind the ridge, ready to respond to breakthroughs or exploit French overextension. The use of terrain, fortified buildings, hedgerows, and shallow ditches enabled the Anglo-Allied army to absorb repeated French attacks without loss of overall defensive integrity. Commanders at the divisional and brigade levels exercised initiative within the overall defensive plan, ensuring continuous coordination and reinforcement across the line. The intensity of the midday phase resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. French infantry experienced substantial losses during repeated assaults on fortified positions, while artillery crews were exposed to counter-battery fire. Cavalry casualties were incurred during massed charges against prepared infantry squares. Coalition forces sustained losses primarily from artillery bombardment and close-quarters engagements at key positions such as La Haye-Sainte and the ridges anchoring the line. Casualty figures during this phase are estimated at approximately 8,000 to 10,000 for the French and 5,000 to 6,000 for the Anglo-Allied forces, reflecting the high-intensity nature of combined arms engagements and the effectiveness of prepared defensive positions. The capture of La Haye-Sainte by French forces represented a turning point in localized terms, but did not compromise the integrity of Wellington's overall line. Defenders repositioned to cover gaps. Artillery concentrated fire on newly exposed sectors, and reserves were committed to maintain cohesion. Napoleon's attempts to exploit this tactical success were constrained by the resilience of surrounding positions, the coordination of Wellington's defense, and the potential threat of Prussian reinforcements advancing from the east. The battle had entered a protracted phase in which incremental gains and attrition, rather than decisive breakthroughs, defined operational dynamics. French artillery continued to play a decisive role during the midday struggle. Batteries were positioned to deliver enfilading fire on Anglo-Allied formations, targeting concentrations of infantry and disrupting the coherence of defensive positions. Coalition artillery responded with accurate and disciplined fire, particularly from elevated positions behind the ridge, inflicting casualties on advancing French columns and limiting the effectiveness of assaults. The interaction between artillery, infantry, and cavalry during this period exemplified the principles of combined arms warfare, illustrating both the potential and limitations of coordinated offensive operations against prepared defenses. Marshal Ney, tasked with maintaining pressure on the Anglo-Allied right, continued repeated attacks on Hougoumont throughout the midday period. French infantry, reinforced by additional battalions, attempted to penetrate the defensive perimeter, while cavalry operations sought to exploit perceived weaknesses. Defenders, including British Guards and Nassau troops, continued to repulse attacks, utilizing internal lines, coordinated fire, and barricades. Casualties among French forces mounted, reflecting both the tenacity of defenders and the operational risk associated with repeated assaults against fortified positions. The protracted fighting at Hougoumont tied down significant French forces, limiting their availability for exploitation of gains elsewhere. On the left flank, French operations near Pays-Plate and other minor positions maintained pressure on coalition forces, fixing troops in place and preventing flexible redeployment. Infantry advanced in column formations supported by artillery, encountering resistance from entrenched Anglo-Allied units. Cavalry actions provided reconnaissance and harassment, but were limited in their capacity to achieve decisive results. These operations, while not producing breakthroughs, contributed to the overall French strategy of attrition and fixation, shaping the allocation of coalition forces and influencing subsequent phases of the battle. Napoleon's command decisions during the midday phase emphasized the sequential application of force, concentration on key points, and exploitation of localized success. The Imperial Guard and Reserve artillery were prepared to reinforce sectors where breakthroughs might occur. Corps commanders were instructed to maintain pressure, coordinate with adjacent formations, and exploit terrain advantages where possible. The limitations encountered during the morning and midday engagements, including effective coalition defenses, attritional casualties, and terrain constraints, required careful adjustment of tactics while maintaining the overarching objective of achieving a decisive collapse of Wellington's line. Wellington's command during the midday struggle reflected the integration of terrain, defensive preparation, and operational coordination. Infantry units were rotated to maintain effectiveness, reserves committed selectively, and artillery concentrated to support threatened sectors. Cavalry remained in reserve to counter breakthroughs or exploit French overextension. The multinational composition of the Anglo-Allied army, including British, Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and Brunswick contingents, required disciplined coordination, effective communication, and adherence to defensive principles to preserve cohesion under sustained French pressure. Commanders at all levels executed tactical decisions within the framework of Wellington's overall defensive plan, ensuring continuity of operations despite intense combat conditions. The arrival of initial reconnaissance reports regarding Prussian movements to the east influenced operational calculations for both sides. Napoleon anticipated potential Prussian intervention and sought to achieve localized superiority before reinforcements could affect the battle. Wellington, informed of Prussian positions, maintained awareness of the necessity to hold key defensive positions while preparing for coordinated support from Allied forces. The interplay between ongoing French assaults, coalition defensive adjustments, and the anticipation of external reinforcement framed the operational environment during the midday phase. The prolonged fighting, attritional losses, and localized tactical gains during the midday struggle established the conditions for subsequent phases of the battle. French forces had achieved limited successes, including the capture of La Haye-Sainte, but faced persistent resistance at Hougoumont and along the flanks. Coalition forces, while sustaining casualties, maintained the integrity of defensive positions, effectively using terrain, fortifications, and disciplined coordination to resist French advances. The battle had transitioned from initial assaults to a protracted struggle in which timing, reserves, and the eventual arrival of Prussian forces would become decisive factors. By mid-afternoon on June 18, 1815, the operational dynamics of the Battle of Waterloo began to shift significantly with the arrival of Prussian forces under the command of Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The Prussian army, having withdrawn in an organized fashion following their engagement at Ligny on June 16, had regrouped and commenced a coordinated advance toward Waterloo to support Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. The presence of these reinforcements introduced a critical two-front challenge for Napoleon Bonaparte, forcing adjustments in French deployment and compelling a redistribution of forces to counter a developing eastern threat. The strategic objective for the Prussians was clear: to link with Wellington's forces, apply pressure on Napoleon's right flank, and prevent the French army from achieving operational superiority before Allied consolidation. Blücher's forces, numbering approximately 50,000 men in total, were organized into three main corps under the command of Generals von Perchay, von Thielmann, and von Bülow. The Prussian advance involved careful coordination to maintain cohesion, synchronize movement across challenging terrain, and ensure that supply and communications remained intact. The approach toward Waterloo required movement along roads constrained by hedgerows, woods, and small settlements, while maintaining readiness for combat engagement. The logistical organization included the management of artillery, cavalry, and infantry units, with emphasis on maintaining operational tempo while avoiding exhaustion or fragmentation of formations during the march. The first elements of the Prussian I Corps under General von Zieten began to engage French forces on the right flank near the villages of Plancenoit and Pays-Plate. The engagement involved skirmishing and artillery exchanges aimed at fixing French forces, preventing them from reallocating troops to the central or left sectors of the battlefield. Prussian infantry advanced in disciplined columns, supported by horse artillery and cavalry reconnaissance units, seeking to establish positions that could anchor subsequent assaults and coordinate with Wellington's defensive line. The advance was executed with attention to terrain features, utilizing wooded areas and minor elevations to mask movements and protect against concentrated French fire. Napoleon, observing reports of Prussian presence and initial contact with French outposts, recognized the operational threat posed to his right flank. French corps previously engaged against Wellington's center and left were partially diverted to address this emerging front, creating strain on the continuity of frontal attacks elsewhere. Marshal Grouchy, who had been detached to pursue Prussian forces after Ligny, was positioned approximately 20 kilometers east and did not engage effectively to prevent the initial Prussian arrival at Waterloo. This limited French capacity to contain Blücher's forces, emphasizing the risk inherent in dividing forces across multiple operational objectives without adequate real-time coordination. The Prussian I and II Corps initiated a series of coordinated attacks on the villages and strongpoints held by French forces on the right flank. Infantry columns advanced under artillery cover, engaging French units positioned in defensive formations along ridges, hedgerows, and small farm complexes. The French, numbering approximately 8,000 to 10,000 in these sectors, utilized light fortifications and terrain to resist initial Prussian attacks, but were gradually compelled to redeploy under pressure. Cavalry engagements occurred in open fields adjacent to the villages, with Prussian squadrons conducting limited charges against exposed French formations and French cavalry countering where terrain permitted. The incremental pressure applied by Prussian forces began to fix French units in place, reducing their availability for operations against Wellington's center and left. Artillery played a decisive role in the Prussian intervention. Batteries were positioned on elevated terrain to deliver enfilading fire into French positions, targeting concentrations of infantry and supporting artillery emplacements. French artillery, previously engaged against Wellington's positions, was partially redeployed to meet this new threat, diminishing the intensity of bombardments on the Anglo-Allied center. The redistribution of artillery and infantry to counter Prussian advances reduced the mass of French offensive capability along the ridge, illustrating the operational impact of a well-timed and coordinated Allied intervention on the battlefield dynamics. The Prussian advance exerted a dual effect: tactical pressure on the French right flank and operational influence on Napoleon's command decisions. French forces, previously engaged in repeated assaults on Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate, were now required to allocate units to meet a new threat, diluting the concentration of effort in the central sector. Napoleon attempted to counteract this by directing reserves, including elements of the Imperial Guard, to reinforce the right and respond to Prussian incursions. This allocation, while reinforcing vulnerable sectors, reduced the available force mass for offensive operations against Wellington's positions and constrained the potential for decisive central breakthroughs. Wellington's headquarters received intelligence regarding Prussian movements and initial contact, allowing coordinated defensive planning to exploit the evolving battlefield conditions. Anglo-Allied forces continued to hold key positions along the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, while reserves remained in readiness to exploit gaps created by French redeployment. Coordination between Wellington and Prussian commanders, facilitated by mounted liaison officers and prearranged signaling methods, ensured that Prussian pressure complemented rather than conflicted with Anglo-Allied defensive operations. This strategic linkage enhanced the effectiveness of coalition operations and complicated French decision-making at critical junctures. By mid-afternoon, Prussian columns under von Bülow and von Thielmann had established positions near Plancenoit, engaging French units in sustained combat. The village and surrounding high ground became focal points for intense infantry and artillery exchanges. Prussian infantry utilized linear formations supported by artillery to advance systematically, while French defenders relied on prepared positions, local terrain, and coordinated fire to resist penetration. Cavalry engagements occurred intermittently, largely in open areas adjacent to the village, with both sides experiencing losses due to disciplined musketry and artillery support. The fighting at Plancenoit, although localized relative to the central ridge, had strategic significance by threatening the stability of Napoleon's right flank and compelling the diversion of French forces from central operations. French command, under Napoleon, attempted to stabilize the situation by committing additional divisions, including light infantry and reserve cavalry, to reinforce sectors under Prussian pressure. Marshal Ney coordinated these movements while maintaining attacks elsewhere, creating a complex operational environment in which forces were dispersed across multiple axes of engagement. The challenge for French command was the simultaneous requirement to maintain pressure on Wellington's positions while countering Prussian advances threatening encirclement or disruption of supply lines. This operational tension reflected the limitations of divided command in responding to multiple coordinated threats across a dispersed battlefield. Prussian artillery, strategically positioned to cover approaches to key villages and open terrain, inflicted casualties on French units and disrupted the cohesion of formations attempting to redeploy or counterattack. Infantry advances were supported by concentrated artillery fire, targeting French columns, gun crews, and exposed infantry formations. The coordination between Prussian infantry and artillery demonstrated operational doctrine emphasizing combined arms and the integration of multiple capabilities to achieve tactical and operational effects. French counter-battery fire was partially effective but constrained by the need to maintain artillery coverage against Wellington's central positions, limiting the overall French artillery concentration in these sectors. The operational effect of Prussian arrival extended beyond immediate tactical pressure. French forces previously engaged in the Central Ridge assaults were now required to allocate attention and manpower to counter the eastern threat, reducing the overall concentration of forces available for decisive action. Napoleon's capacity to achieve local superiority at critical points was therefore diminished, while coalition forces benefited from the simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. Wellington, maintaining defensive cohesion, was able to exploit this strategic advantage by holding key positions and preparing for counteroffensive actions once French formations became overextended. By mid to late afternoon, the engagement at Plancenoit had intensified, with Prussian forces gradually gaining incremental control over the village and surrounding approaches. French defenders, including elements of the Young Guard and line infantry, mounted determined resistance, utilizing buildings, fences, and local topography to delay Prussian advances. Casualties were significant on both sides, with French losses exacerbated by repeated assaults and artillery bombardment. The gradual pressure exerted by Prussian forces created operational strain for Napoleon, forcing continued redistribution of reserves and limiting the potential for concentrated assaults on Wellington's center. The integration of Prussian forces into the broader coalition effort demonstrated the importance of timely and coordinated reinforcements in Napoleonic warfare. Blücher's intervention not only applied direct tactical pressure, but also influenced strategic decision-making on the French side, compelling diversion of forces and constraining offensive options. The ability of coalition commanders to maintain communication, synchronize operations, and exploit terrain and timing reinforced the resilience of Allied defenses and highlighted the limitations inherent in Napoleon's strategy when confronted by well-coordinated, multinational opposition. Throughout the afternoon, Prussian advances remained methodical and deliberate, focusing on securing key terrain features, anchoring positions for further engagement, and integrating with Wellington's defensive line. French attempts to repel these advances required commitment of infantry, cavalry, and artillery in sectors increasingly distant from the central assault on Wellington's positions. The operational effect of this two-front pressure gradually shifted momentum, reducing the French capacity for concentrated decisive action and setting the conditions for the eventual collapse of key French formations later in the battle. The timing of Prussian arrival, coupled with the coordinated pressure applied against Napoleon's right flank, created a cumulative effect that undermined French operational cohesion. Units previously concentrated for central assaults were dispersed, artillery support was reduced in critical sectors, and command coordination was challenged by the need to respond simultaneously to multiple threats. Casualties continued to mount, particularly among French infantry and cavalry committed to resisting Prussian incursions. The cumulative attrition, operational distraction, and tactical pressure applied by Prussian forces fundamentally altered the battlefield environment, creating conditions for coalition counteractions and influencing the strategic decisions that would determine the outcome of the engagement. By late afternoon, Prussian forces had firmly established their presence on Napoleon's right flank, with incremental territorial gains achieved in and around Plancenoit. French attempts to stabilize these positions required continuous allocation of troops from other sectors, further diminishing the concentration of forces available for central operations against Wellington's Ridge. The effective synchronization of Prussian operations with Wellington's defensive dispositions created an operational synergy, whereby French forces were constrained, coalition positions remained resilient, and the overall battlefield dynamic increasingly favored the Allies. By the late afternoon of June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo had reached a critical juncture characterized by the cumulative effects of sustained French assaults, coalition defensive resilience, and the coordinated pressure exerted by the arrival of Prussian forces on Napoleon's right flank. The operational situation for the French army had deteriorated steadily over the course of the day. Despite initial tactical successes, such as the capture of La Haye-Sainte, Napoleon faced increasing attrition over extended lines, and the emergence of a dual-front engagement that constrained his capacity to achieve decisive breakthroughs. The Anglo-Allied army, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, maintained defensive cohesion along the Mont-Saint-Jean Ridge, while Prussian forces, advancing from the east, exerted mounting operational pressure, creating conditions that would precipitate the collapse of the French army. French forces, initially numbering approximately 73,000 men at the start of the battle, had incurred substantial casualties during repeated assaults on fortified positions such as Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate. Infantry units, engaged in continuous frontal attacks and attritional combat, experienced exhaustion and losses, while cavalry formations had been diminished through repeated charges against disciplined infantry squares and supporting artillery fire. Artillery crews, having operated under sustained counter-battery fire and coalition musketry, suffered losses that reduced the overall firepower available for central and flanking operations. These cumulative effects weakened the operational capacity of French forces at the critical late stage of the battle. The Anglo-Allied army, numbering approximately 68,000 troops, maintained the integrity of defensive positions along the ridge. Infantry formations, organized into squares and linear arrangements, absorbed repeated French assaults, supported by strategically positioned artillery batteries capable of delivering enfilading and direct fire. Cavalry units remained in reserve to exploit breaches or counter French charges, while command coordination between British, Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and Brunswick contingents ensured continuity of defensive operations. By late afternoon, Wellington's forces were positioned to exploit French overextension, with reserves ready for counterattacks once operational openings presented themselves. On the French right flank, Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher had established a firm presence, applying sustained pressure against French units positioned near Plancenoit and surrounding terrain. Infantry columns advanced under artillery support, engaging French defenders in sustained combat. Cavalry units conducted reconnaissance and limited charges against exposed positions, while Prussian artillery targeted concentrations of French infantry and disrupted attempts at countermaneuvering. The cumulative effect of Prussian pressure forced Napoleon to divert units from central and left operations to stabilize the right flank, diluting the concentration of forces previously committed to decisive assaults on Wellington's Ridge. Marshal Ney continued to coordinate French attacks against the Anglo-Allied right and center, including renewed assaults on Hougoumont and the center near La Haye-Sainte. Infantry columns advanced under artillery cover, while cavalry attempted mass charges against infantry squares. These operations, however, met with increasingly effective coalition resistance. Infantry squares, maintained under disciplined command, delivered coordinated musket volleys, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking cavalry. Artillery fire disrupted French infantry cohesion, while reserves positioned by Wellington were committed selectively to reinforce threatened sectors. Despite determined assaults, French forces were unable to achieve decisive penetration of the defensive line. Napoleon, recognizing the deteriorating operational situation, committed elements of the Imperial Guard, including the Old Guard and Middle Guard, as a final strategic reserve aimed at restoring momentum and achieving a decisive breakthrough. These units, elite and experienced, advanced in massed columns supported by artillery, targeting the center of Wellington's line. The deployment of the Guard represented a critical attempt to reverse battlefield fortunes, concentrating veteran troops against perceived vulnerabilities in the Anglo-Allied defensive disposition. Command and control measures ensured coordination between the Guard and other French units, with mounted messengers relaying orders and adjustments in real time. The advance of the Imperial Guard was met by disciplined defensive fire from Wellington's infantry, supported by artillery batteries positioned along the ridge. Infantry squares delivered sustained musket volleys, while artillery inflicted casualties and disrupted formations. Cavalry reserves were deployed to exploit any signs of the French faltering, but the Guard maintained cohesion during initial engagement. Despite their experience and training, the Imperial Guard encountered the cumulative effects of attrition, disrupted coordination with other French units, and the ongoing pressure from Prussian forces on the right flank. These factors prevented the Guard from achieving the localized superiority necessary for a breakthrough. Simultaneously, Prussian forces intensified operations near Plancenoit, gradually capturing portions of the village and engaging French units in sustained combat. The French Young Guard and line infantry attempted to resist, utilizing buildings, fences, and terrain to delay Prussian advances. Artillery exchanges further compounded the pressure, as Prussian batteries targeted French formations attempting to reorganize or counterattack. The operational effect was significant. French units were increasingly fixed in defensive or delaying actions, reducing their availability to support central assaults and exposing vulnerabilities in the overall French line. By late afternoon, French attacks across the battlefield were characterized by exhaustion, attritional losses, and diminishing cohesion. Infantry units, depleted from repeated assaults, were less effective in maintaining formation and executing coordinated attacks. Cavalry units, reduced in number and effectiveness, were unable to exploit tactical openings or support infantry operations effectively. Artillery, limited by losses and redistribution requirements, provided insufficient concentrated fire to achieve disruption of coalition formations. The cumulative result was the progressive erosion of French offensive capability, leaving the army increasingly vulnerable to coalition counteraction. Wellington, observing signs of French weakening and overextension, initiated counteroffensive operations. Reserves previously held in readiness were committed to sectors where French assaults had faltered, including central positions near La Haye-Sainte and adjacent hedgerow lines. Infantry advanced in coordinated formations, supported by artillery fire, to regain positions lost earlier in the engagement or to exploit gaps in French formations. Cavalry units, positioned behind the ridge, were deployed to pursue withdrawing French units, disrupt cohesion, and prevent reorganization. These coordinated actions reflected the integration of defensive strategy with offensive exploitation at critical junctures. The combination of sustained Anglo-Allied counterattacks and Prussian pressure on the right flank induced a progressive collapse of French formations. Infantry units previously engaged in offensive operations were compelled to retreat or adopt defensive postures, while artillery and cavalry were repositioned to protect retreating units or respond to emergent threats. Command coordination within the French army became increasingly strained, as communications across dispersed and heavily engaged units were disrupted by battlefield congestion, casualties among officers, and the necessity of simultaneous defensive and offensive operations. At Plancenoit, the Prussian advance continued to erode French control, capturing key buildings, sections of the village, and adjacent high ground. French defenders, including elements of the Guard and line infantry, resisted determinately but were progressively outflanked and overwhelmed by combined infantry and artillery pressure. Casualties mounted, and the operational flexibility of French units in this sector was significantly reduced. The Prussian presence not only threatened the French right flank, but also forced Napoleon to allocate additional reserves to prevent complete penetration, further reducing the capacity for central offensive operations against Wellington. The failure of the Imperial Guard to achieve a breakthrough at the center marked a decisive turning point. Despite initial cohesion and combat effectiveness, the Guard encountered disciplined infantry squares, sustained artillery fire, and operational attrition that prevented localized superiority. The inability to break Wellington's line, combined with the dual pressure from the Prussian right and exhausted French units elsewhere, precipitated a gradual, cascading collapse of French formations. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery units began to withdraw in an uncoordinated fashion, while command efforts to reorganize or stabilize positions became increasingly ineffective under sustained coalition pressure. Wellington's counterattacks, conducted in conjunction with the continued pressure from Prussian forces, accelerated the disintegration of French operational cohesion. Infantry formations advanced, retaking positions previously lost or occupied by weakened French units, while cavalry pursued retreating elements, capturing prisoners and disrupting the potential for reformation. Artillery fire targeted retreating columns and exposed formations, further increasing attrition and preventing effective withdrawal. The integration of Anglo-Allied and Prussian operations created a cumulative effect in which French defensive and offensive capabilities were simultaneously neutralized. By late afternoon and early evening, French command recognized the strategic impossibility of reversing the operational trajectory. Units across the battlefield were withdrawing in disorder, casualties mounting, and cohesion lost in multiple sectors. Napoleon personally attempted to rally troops, visiting key positions and issuing directives to re-establish control, but the combined effects of attrition, overextension, and coordinated coalition pressure rendered these efforts ineffective. French cavalry and infantry, lacking reserves and facing increasing opposition, were incapable of mounting organized offensive operations, and the battlefield increasingly reflected an irreversible shift in momentum toward the coalition forces. Cavalry and infantry of the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies conducted systematic pursuit operations, targeting retreating French units and preventing reorganization. The pursuit, conducted along roads and open fields south and east of Waterloo, inflicted further casualties, captured artillery and equipment, and disorganized remaining French formations. The collapse of French offensive capacity coincided with the capture of key terrain features previously contested, including Plancenoit and sections of La Haye-Sainte, reinforcing the operational dominance of coalition forces. By this stage, the French army's capacity for organized resistance was effectively nullified, and the tactical and operational initiative rested firmly with Wellington and Blücher. The operational outcome of the evening climax was the comprehensive collapse of French army cohesion. Infantry formations, cavalry, and artillery units were in retreat or disarray, command structures disrupted, and remaining reserves insufficient to influence the course of events. Casualties across the French army, including those sustained during earlier morning and midday engagements, combined with late afternoon attrition, had reduced effective combat strength significantly. Napoleon's strategic objectives, reliant on rapid, decisive victories, were no longer attainable under the conditions created by coalition defensive resilience and Prussian reinforcement. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815 presented a complex operational, strategic, and political situation for Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat marked the termination of the Hundred Days Campaign and the end of his ambitions for European domination. French forces had suffered catastrophic losses in both personnel and material, the scale of which directly impacted the French military's ability to maintain field operations. Casualty figures, while varying according to sources, are widely estimated at approximately 25,000 to 30,000 for the French, encompassing killed, wounded, and missing, including prisoners captured by coalition forces. The Anglo-Allied army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, incurred roughly 17,000 casualties, while the Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher suffered approximately 7,000 casualties. These figures reflect the intensity of the combat, the scale of engagement across multiple fronts, and the attritional nature of the battlefield operations throughout the day. French infantry bore the majority of casualties, particularly among units engaged in repeated assaults on fortified positions such as Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Plancenoit. Infantry battalions experienced attrition through concentrated musket fire, artillery bombardment, and engagement with disciplined infantry squares. French cavalry formations also sustained significant losses during repeated charges against prepared positions, highlighting both the tactical limitations of cavalry against well-coordinated infantry formations and the high-risk nature of such offensive operations in Napoleonic warfare. Artillery units, engaged in both offensive and counter-battery operations, suffered personnel losses and loss of guns due to coalition action, further diminishing French operational capacity. The aftermath of the battle also involved substantial operational disruption for French forces. Units in retreat frequently abandoned artillery, equipment, and supplies, contributing to a degradation of logistical capability and the overall combat readiness of the army. Command and control structures were disrupted due to casualties among officers, loss of communication, and the chaotic nature of the withdrawal under sustained coalition pressure. The disorganization of retreating French units limited their ability to regroup for continued offensive operations or organized withdrawal to defensible positions. The operational collapse of Napoleon's forces at Waterloo thus had both immediate and longer-term implications for the strategic situation in France and across Europe. The coalition forces, despite incurring significant casualties, maintained operational cohesion and command integrity. Wellington's leadership, coordination of multinational contingents, and effective use of terrain enabled the Anglo-Allied army to absorb French attacks while preparing for counterattacks. Prussian forces, arriving in the afternoon and engaging on the French right flank, contributed decisively to the collapse of French operational coherence. Their timely intervention not only applied direct tactical pressure, but also disrupted French planning and forced diversion of critical reserves. The integration of Anglo-Allied and Prussian operations illustrated the effectiveness of coalition strategy and the impact of coordination in Napoleonic warfare. Following the cessation of organized French resistance, Napoleon returned to Paris under urgent political and military circumstances. The defeat at Waterloo undermined his authority and removed the possibility of continued operational success. Within days, Napoleon faced insurmountable pressure from both domestic political actors and the Allied powers converging on France. On June 22, 1815, he issued his second abdication in favor of his son, Napoleon II, who was not able to assume practical authority. The abdication marked the definitive termination of Napoleon's rule and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII, effectively concluding the 100 Days campaign. The immediate political consequences of Waterloo were profound. The victory of the coalition reinforced the position of the great powers that had participated in the Seventh Coalition: Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and other allies, solidifying their collective capacity to enforce the post-Napoleonic settlement envisioned at the Congress of Vienna. The battle demonstrated the continued effectiveness of coalition coordination and the strategic necessity of a multilateral response to aggressive French ambitions. In the months following Waterloo, Allied forces occupied key regions of France to ensure compliance with the terms of settlement, prevent the resurgence of Napoleonic forces, and stabilize European political structures. Napoleon's eventual exile to St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic controlled by the British, represented the final containment of his political and military influence. The exile ensured that Napoleon could no longer pose a direct threat to European stability. The conditions of his exile were rigorously enforced by British authorities, including the deployment of naval forces to prevent escape. Napoleon remained on St. Helena until he died in 1821, during which time he authored memoirs and maintained correspondence that contributed to the historical record of his campaigns. The exile of Napoleon reflected both the punitive and preventive measures adopted by the Allied powers to secure post-war order. The social and economic consequences of Waterloo were also significant, particularly in France. The French army's decimation, coupled with the loss of equipment and logistical resources, impaired local economies dependent on military requisition and support. Casualties among enlisted men and officers contributed to demographic disruption, while the displacement of soldiers and refugees affected communities across northern France and Belgium. The broader European context also reflected the financial cost of sustained coalition campaigns, including provisioning, troop maintenance, and compensation for losses incurred during the campaign. Strategically, the battle reinforced the principles of coalition warfare, highlighting the importance of timely coordination, intelligence, and operational synergy. The integration of Prussian forces with Wellington's Anglo-Allied army demonstrated that battlefield success in the Napoleonic era often depended on the ability of multiple national contingents to operate in a coordinated manner under unified strategic objectives. The operational lessons of Waterloo influenced subsequent military doctrine, including the emphasis on defensive depth, use of terrain, combined arms operations, and the critical importance of reserves in maintaining flexibility and responding to emergent threats. The defeat at Waterloo also solidified the geopolitical landscape of Europe in accordance with the Congress of Vienna's objectives. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, the enforcement of territorial boundaries, and the establishment of buffer states in Belgium and the Rhineland reflected the Allied commitment to a balance of power that could prevent future large-scale continental conflict. These arrangements, reinforced by military demonstrations such as Waterloo, created a framework for European stability that would persist through the 19th century, albeit challenged intermittently by regional conflicts and nationalist movements. In terms of military historiography, Waterloo represented the culmination of Napoleonic operational practice, integrating lessons from previous campaigns with the realities of coalition resistance. The battle illustrated the strengths of Napoleon's command, including strategic initiative, rapid maneuver, and combined arms integration, while simultaneously exposing limitations such as over-reliance on concentrated assault, underestimation of coalition resilience, and vulnerability to coordinated Allied intervention. These operational insights informed subsequent military thought, including studies on command decision-making, battlefield cohesion, and coalition strategy. The aftermath of Waterloo also influenced the development of international norms regarding warfare, occupation, and the treatment of exiled political figures. Napoleon's confinement on St. Helena, monitored and enforced by British military presence, became a model of controlled political exile, balancing punitive measures with the prevention of renewed conflict. The broader European response, including the occupation of French territory and diplomatic reinforcement of settlement terms, underscored the evolving framework for collective security and the enforcement of post-war settlements. From a human perspective, the scale of casualties, the disruption of communities, and the displacement of soldiers and civilians highlighted the broader societal costs of Napoleonic warfare. Hospitals, makeshift medical facilities, and local populations were mobilized to care for wounded soldiers from both the French and coalition armies. The logistical challenges of managing medical care, provisioning, and evacuation reflected the operational realities of 19th century warfare, as well as the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge and infrastructure in responding to mass casualties. The material aftermath of Waterloo included the recovery of captured artillery, arms, and supplies, the clearing of battlefield terrain, and the reorganization of surviving forces. French units that retreated in disorder required reintegration, retraining, and replenishment, while coalition forces consolidated control over contested territory. The extensive destruction of villages, farms, and infrastructure in the immediate battle zone necessitated reconstruction and logistical support, underscoring the enduring impact of military operations on local economies and communities. Waterloo's historical significance extended beyond immediate military and political outcomes. The battle became a reference point for military education, strategic analysis, and doctrinal development throughout Europe. Studies of the engagement emphasized the interplay of defensive strategy, offensive initiative, coalition coordination, and the importance of timely reinforcement. Commanders and military theorists analyzed the operational decisions of Napoleon, Wellington, and Blücher to extract lessons on force concentration, terrain utilization, reserve management, and the integration of multinational forces in complex campaigns. The broader European political context after Waterloo reflected both continuity and transformation. The Congress of Vienna's arrangements were reinforced, including territorial settlements, restoration of traditional dynasties, and the establishment of mechanisms to prevent unilateral military aggression. Simultaneously, the battle demonstrated that military outcomes could decisively influence political settlements, shaping the trajectory of international relations in the immediate post-Napoleonic era. The strategic recalibration of European powers, informed by the outcomes of Waterloo, set the stage for diplomatic, military, and economic developments throughout the 19th century. The psychological and symbolic impact of Waterloo was also significant. Napoleon's final defeat reinforced the perception of coalition strength, deterrence capability, and the limits of individual military genius in the face of coordinated opposition. The battle's outcome influenced contemporary and subsequent narratives regarding leadership, operational decision-making, and the interplay between political authority and military effectiveness. These interpretations contributed to the historiography of the Napoleonic era and informed national and continental perspectives on military, political, and strategic history. The Battle of Waterloo offers a comprehensive case study in Napoleonic warfare, illustrating the interaction of strategy, tactics, command decisions, and coalition dynamics in a high-intensity operational environment. Analyzing the battle requires examination of both French and coalition approaches, their operational execution, and the factors that determine the outcome. From the outset, the engagement demonstrated the significance of defensive positioning, coordinated multinational operations, terrain utilization, force disposition, and the timing of reinforcements. These elements collectively shaped the tactical and operational lessons derived from the battle and have influenced military theory, doctrine, and historiography in subsequent centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte's strategy at Waterloo reflected principles consistent with his earlier campaigns, emphasizing rapid maneuver, concentrated attacks, and the attempt to achieve local superiority against separated Allied contingents. His operational plan relied on defeating the Prussian and Anglo-Allied armies sequentially, preventing their consolidation and enabling a decisive strike that could restore French dominance in Belgium and beyond. In practice, this strategy required precise timing, effective reconnaissance, and the rapid coordination of multiple corps. French forces, numbering approximately 73,000 at the outset of the battle, were arrayed in a conventional Napoleonic formation with infantry at the core, cavalry on the flanks, and artillery deployed to support both offensive and defensive actions. Marshal Ney, responsible for leading the cavalry engagements, and Marshal Grouchy, assigned to pursue the Prussians after Ligny, were integral components of this operational plan. However, the effectiveness of these arrangements was contingent upon both accurate assessment of enemy movements and timely execution of orders. The Anglo-Allied army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, exemplified defensive operational doctrine, emphasizing the use of terrain, fortifications, and disciplined formations to absorb enemy attacks while minimizing vulnerability to decisive breakthroughs. Wellington selected the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge as the primary defensive line, utilizing the natural slope to shield infantry and artillery positions. Key locations such as Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate were fortified and garrisoned with sufficient forces to delay and disrupt French assaults. Infantry squares provided protection against cavalry, while strategically positioned artillery delivered enfilading fire and concentrated bombardments against advancing columns. Wellington's deployment demonstrated the integration of tactical discipline, terrain exploitation, and defensive depth as critical elements of operational resilience. One of the most significant tactical aspects of Waterloo was the execution of frontal assaults against well-prepared positions. French infantry repeatedly attacked fortified farms and villages, often in massed columns supported by artillery and cavalry. These attacks, while initially achieving limited gains such as the capture of La Haye-Sainte, incurred disproportionate casualties and highlighted the limitations of concentrated assault against prepared defensive positions. Infantry squares proved resilient to cavalry charges, and artillery support for the defenders mitigated the effectiveness of French offensive firepower. The operational consequence of these engagements was the attrition of French forces, a reduction in offensive flexibility, and eventual inability to achieve the massed superiority necessary for a decisive breakthrough. Cavalry operations, particularly those led by Marshal Ney, further illustrate the interplay of doctrine and battlefield conditions. French cavalry conducted repeated charges against Anglo-Allied infantry squares, initially seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses or breaches. However, the effectiveness of these charges was diminished by the disciplined cohesion of infantry formations, combined with supporting artillery fire. In several instances, cavalry charges incurred high casualties without achieving significant operational effect. The tactical lesson derived from these actions underscores the importance of combined arms coordination, reconnaissance, and situational awareness when employing cavalry against prepared positions, emphasizing that cavalry alone could not achieve decisive results against well-formed infantry. The timing and impact of Prussian intervention under Field Marshal Blücher represent a critical operational lesson in coalition warfare. The arrival of Prussian forces on the French right flank in the mid-afternoon introduced a second operational axis, forcing Napoleon to divert units from central assaults and weakening French offensive cohesion. The Prussian advance, systematically executed in coordinated columns supported by artillery, demonstrated the value of disciplined maneuver, communication, and synchronization within multinational operations. The integration of Prussian and Anglo-Allied forces illustrates the effectiveness of coalition strategy when multiple armies operate under unified objectives and complementary operational timelines. For Napoleon, the inability to prevent or delay Prussian engagement exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in sequential attack strategies when confronted with coordinated opposition. Artillery employment during Waterloo provides further insight into tactical and operational considerations. French artillery, deployed in support of infantry and cavalry assaults, delivered bombardments intended to disrupt defensive formations and facilitate breakthroughs. Coalition artillery, particularly that of the Anglo-Allied Army, was positioned to maximize enfilading fire, target French columns, and protect key positions. The effective placement, coordination, and sustained operation of artillery contributed decisively to defensive success and illustrated the importance of firepower integration within combined arms operations. Moreover, the redistribution of French artillery to respond to Prussian pressure reduced its effectiveness against central objectives, demonstrating the impact of multi-front threats on force allocation. Command and control dynamics at Waterloo further elucidate operational lessons. Napoleon's reliance on subordinate marshals to execute coordinated attacks highlighted both the strengths and limitations of centralized planning with distributed execution. Miscommunication, delayed reports, and independent operational choices, particularly by Grouchy and Ney, constrained the ability to respond effectively to emergent threats. Conversely, Wellington maintained a centralized yet flexible command approach, retaining reserves and issuing orders that accommodated the evolving battlefield environment. Coordination with Prussian forces, facilitated by liaison officers and prior planning, exemplified effective coalition command, ensuring that pressure applied on multiple fronts was synchronized rather than duplicative. These contrasts emphasize the critical importance of timely communication, adaptive command structures, and operational awareness in complex engagements. The strategic use of terrain at Waterloo represents a further tactical consideration. Wellington's selection of the ridge, combined with the occupation of key villages and farms, maximized defensive advantage and mitigated the numerical superiority of French forces in concentrated assaults. Elevation protected from artillery, while natural obstacles disrupted cavalry maneuver and slowed infantry advances. The deliberate integration of fortified positions, hedgerows, and minor elevations demonstrates the enduring relevance of terrain analysis in planning both offensive and defensive operations. For Napoleon, the inability to fully exploit maneuver space limited the potential for flanking attacks or envelopment, underscoring the operational significance of terrain in constraining or enabling tactical options. The coordination and timing of reserves were decisive in determining the outcome of engagements at Waterloo. Wellington's retention of significant reserve forces enabled selective counterattacks and reinforcement of threatened sectors, contributing to the absorption of French assaults and stabilization of defensive positions. Conversely, Napoleon's deployment of the Imperial Guard as a final attempt to restore momentum, while theoretically sound, occurred at a stage when French forces were already overextended, attrited, and under pressure from both coalition axes. The relative effectiveness of reserve employment illustrates the operational advantage conferred by flexible allocation of forces and the consequences of committing reserves prematurely or under conditions of declining cohesion. Logistical considerations, though often understated in tactical analysis, played a notable role in operational execution. The movement of artillery, the provisioning of infantry and cavalry, and the maintenance of communication lines were all factors influencing French and coalition effectiveness. Prussian forces demonstrated logistical discipline in maintaining supply lines during rapid movement from Ligny to Waterloo, enabling sustained engagement upon arrival. Coalition coordination ensured that multinational forces could operate effectively in a shared operational theater, with sufficient supplies, ammunition, and operational readiness maintained despite extended maneuver. For the French, attrition and redistribution of forces created pressure on logistical support, contributing to operational limitations in the late stages of the battle. Waterloo also illustrates the strategic impact of morale and cohesion under attritional pressure. French units, despite initial offensive impetus, experienced progressive degradation in cohesion due to sustained casualties, battlefield fatigue, and disruption of command links. Anglo-Allied and Prussian units, though also experiencing losses, maintained cohesion through disciplined formations, effective leadership, and integrated support. The operational consequence was a shift in initiative, wherein coalition forces retained the capacity to exploit emerging weaknesses, while French forces became increasingly reactive and constrained in operational options. The relationship between cohesion, morale, and operational effectiveness remains a central lesson in the study of Napoleonic warfare. The operational interplay between sequential and simultaneous engagement also provides a critical lesson. Napoleon's reliance on defeating enemy forces in isolation was undermined by effective coalition coordination and timely reinforcement. The simultaneous pressure applied by Anglo-Allied forces along the ridge and Prussian forces on the right flank created a complex operational environment in which French forces were unable to concentrate sufficient combat power at critical points. This highlights the limitations of sequential defeat strategies when facing opponents capable of synchronized multi-axis operations, emphasizing the importance of operational flexibility, situational awareness, and the ability to anticipate and counter emergent threats. Waterloo further demonstrates the interaction between tactical doctrine and technological capabilities. Infantry squares, linear formations, and coordinated artillery demonstrated the effective application of existing Napoleonic tactics under modern battlefield conditions. Cavalry, while capable of localized impact, was constrained by the effective use of defensive formations and artillery integration. Artillery deployment, both in terms of placement and sustained operation, significantly influenced the attritional outcome of engagements, reflecting the importance of combined arms integration in achieving operational objectives. The limitations and strengths of each arm, when employed in concert or in isolation, provide enduring insight into tactical and operational planning. Finally, the battle underscores the enduring importance of coalition strategy in military history. The effective coordination of multinational forces, integration of reserves, and timing of reinforcements were decisive in achieving operational success. The combination of Wellington's disciplined defensive approach and Blücher's timely intervention exemplifies the effectiveness of coalition operations when strategic objectives are aligned, communication is maintained, and operational pressure is applied across multiple axes. The lessons derived from Waterloo regarding coalition warfare, multi-front operations, and operational coordination remain central to the study of military science and strategic planning. The Battle of Waterloo presents a comprehensive framework for examining the principles of Napoleonic warfare, highlighting the interaction of strategy, tactics, operational planning, and coalition dynamics. A detailed analysis of the engagement reveals critical lessons regarding command decisions, force disposition, terrain utilization, combined arms integration, timing of reserves, and the effects of coordination in multinational operations. The operational outcome at Waterloo was determined not merely by the numerical strength of the forces involved, but by the effectiveness of their deployment, the resilience of defensive formations, and the interaction of strategic initiative with battlefield constraints. Napoleon's operational plan reflected a continuation of his established doctrine, emphasizing rapid maneuver, concentration of forces at decisive points, and sequential engagement of isolated enemy contingents. The French strategy aimed to divide and defeat the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher before they could consolidate. Napoleon deployed approximately 73,000 troops, distributed among infantry, cavalry, and artillery, organized into corps under his marshals. Infantry formed the core of offensive operations, with cavalry on the flanks and artillery supporting both attack and defense. Marshal Ney, commanding the French cavalry, was tasked with exploiting breakthroughs and protecting flanks, while Grouchy was designated to pursue the Prussian forces to prevent them from rejoining the main engagement. The success of this plan depended on accurate reconnaissance, timely execution, and strict adherence to coordinated movements across dispersed formations. The Anglo-Allied forces under Wellington, numbering around 68,000, demonstrated a doctrine centered on defensive depth, use of terrain, and the integration of multiple national contingents. Wellington selected the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge as the primary line of defense, utilizing the slope to shield infantry and artillery positions. Key locations such as Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Pays-Plate were fortified and garrisoned to serve as anchor points, slowing French advances and providing defensive depth. Infantry formations employed linear arrangements and square formations to resist cavalry, while strategically positioned artillery delivered enfilading and direct fire against advancing columns. The cohesion and resilience of these formations exemplified a disciplined defensive doctrine capable of absorbing repeated offensive actions without collapse. A central tactical lesson from Waterloo concerns the effectiveness of frontal assaults against prepared positions. French infantry repeatedly launched attacks on fortified farms and villages in massed columns, often supported by artillery and cavalry. While initially achieving localized successes, such as the capture of La Haye-Sainte, these attacks incurred disproportionate casualties. Infantry squares and defensive artillery mitigated the impact of French advances, illustrating that massed offensive action against well-prepared defenses could be costly and operationally limiting. These engagements emphasized the necessity of combined arms coordination, accurate reconnaissance, and flexible operational adaptation to battlefield conditions. Cavalry operations during the battle further demonstrate the interplay between doctrine and battlefield realities. French cavalry, particularly under Ney, conducted multiple charges against Anglo-Allied squares, initially seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses or breaches. The disciplined cohesion of infantry squares, reinforced by supporting artillery, rendered many cavalry charges ineffective, often resulting in heavy losses without operational gain. The tactical lesson is that cavalry, while highly mobile and capable of exploiting vulnerabilities, required integration with infantry and artillery to achieve decisive effects, and that unsupported cavalry operations were inherently vulnerable against disciplined formations. The arrival and engagement of Prussian forces under Blücher constitute a critical operational factor in the battle's outcome. Prussian troops, arriving from the east in the mid-afternoon, applied sustained pressure against the French right flank. Coordinated infantry advances, supported by artillery, forced Napoleon to divert units from central attacks, thereby diluting offensive strength. The Prussian intervention demonstrated the value of timely reinforcement, strategic synchronization, and disciplined maneuver in coalition warfare. It also highlighted the vulnerability of sequential engagement strategies, as Napoleon's assumption that he could defeat the Allied contingents separately was undermined by effective Allied coordination and operational timing. Artillery deployment and employment played a decisive role in shaping battlefield outcomes. French artillery supported offensive columns with bombardments intended to disrupt coalition formations and create breaches. Coalition artillery, especially that of the Anglo-Allied forces, was positioned to maximize enfilade fire and target advancing French columns, thereby imposing attrition and impeding momentum. The effectiveness of artillery was enhanced by terrain selection, elevation, and integration with infantry formations. The redistribution of French artillery to respond to Prussian pressure on the right flank reduced concentration on central objectives, highlighting the operational consequences of multi-front engagement and the criticality of artillery massing at decisive points. Command and control dynamics at Waterloo illustrate the challenges of coordinating large-scale operations under conditions of high attrition and dispersed formations. Napoleon's reliance on subordinate marshals to execute complex maneuvers demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of distributed command. Miscommunications, delayed reports, and independent operational choices, particularly by Grouchy and Ney, constrained Napoleon's ability to maintain cohesion and adapt to emergent battlefield conditions. Conversely, Wellington maintained a centralized yet flexible command approach, retaining reserves and issuing adaptive orders responsive to evolving conditions. Liaison with Prussian forces ensured coordinated action across national contingents, illustrating the operational advantage of aligned objectives and robust communication. The use of terrain exemplified a significant tactical advantage for the Anglo-Allied forces. Wellington's selection of the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge and occupation of key farms and villages maximized defensive effectiveness while constraining French maneuver options. Elevation protected artillery, hedgerows, and fences impeded cavalry, and fortifications anchored defensive positions. Napoleon's inability to fully exploit flanking opportunities or maneuver terrain constraints limited operational flexibility, demonstrating that terrain can significantly influence both offensive potential and defensive resilience. The integration of natural and constructed obstacles into defensive planning remains a key lesson in military operations. The management and deployment of reserves at Waterloo provided decisive operational leverage. Wellington retained substantial reserves throughout the day, committing them to threatened sectors and counterattacking at critical moments. Conversely, Napoleon's deployment of the Imperial Guard as a final measure occurred when French forces were already overextended and fatigued, limiting its effectiveness. The contrast illustrates the operational advantage conferred by judicious reserve management and the risks associated with committing elite formations under deteriorating conditions without sufficient support or operational opportunity. Logistical considerations, although often secondary in tactical narratives, influenced battlefield outcomes. The movement and provisioning of artillery, infantry, and cavalry were critical to maintaining operational capacity. Prussian forces effectively managed supply lines and maintained operational readiness during rapid marches from Ligny to Waterloo, enabling timely engagement. Coalition coordination ensured the sustainment of multinational forces in a shared operational theater, including ammunition resupply and medical support. For the French, attrition, dispersal, and reactive deployment created logistical constraints that limited operational endurance and the capacity for sustained offensive action. Cohesion and morale were central to operational effectiveness. French units, though initially aggressive, experienced progressive degradation of cohesion due to sustained combat, casualties, and disruption of command. Anglo-Allied and Prussian units maintained cohesion under comparable attrition through disciplined formations, effective leadership, and mutual support. The shift in initiative from French forces to coalition forces during late afternoon and evening demonstrates the operational significance of maintaining unit cohesion, morale, and command integrity in high-intensity engagements. Disruption of cohesion among French units contributed directly to the failure of counterattacks and eventual operational collapse. The interaction of sequential and simultaneous engagement further elucidates operational lessons. Napoleon's strategy of defeating Allied contingents individually was undermined by coalition coordination and timely reinforcement. The simultaneous pressure applied by Anglo-Allied forces along the ridge and Prussian forces on the right flank prevented the concentration of French combat power, demonstrating the limitations of sequential engagement when opponents are capable of synchronized multi-axis operations. Operational flexibility, situational awareness, and the capacity to respond to multiple threats are key determinants in complex campaigns, as demonstrated by Waterloo. Technological and doctrinal factors were also integral to operational outcomes. Infantry squares, linear formations, and coordinated artillery reflected the effective application of existing Napoleonic doctrine under contemporary battlefield conditions. Cavalry operations demonstrated both potential and limitations in mass charges against prepared formations. Artillery, when effectively sighted and concentrated, imposed decisive attrition. Combined arms integration, coordination of maneuver elements, and adaptation to battlefield conditions were determining factors in operational success, highlighting the enduring relevance of doctrine aligned with technology and terrain. Finally, the coalition's strategic coordination at Waterloo offers enduring lessons in joint operations. Wellington's defensive planning and reserve deployment, combined with Blücher's timely engagement and operational pressure on the French right flank, exemplified the effectiveness of coalition strategy when national contingents operate under aligned objectives and communication protocols. Coordination, timing, and synchronization proved decisive, ensuring that French operational efforts were neutralized despite numerical parity and Napoleon's tactical competence. Waterloo thereby provides a model for the study of coalition operations, multi-front coordination, and the integration of tactical and strategic considerations in complex campaigns.